Next up, I'm going to introduce two new elements, divs and spans, but first, two important keywords, inline and block elements. These terms refer to how a given element actually fits in with the flow of content in a document. So we've already seen this before, just with this example website, or I don't want to call it a website, this example document we created. We have something like an H1 or an H2, which automatically takes up the entire line of content. It doesn't matter if there's something after it that could fit here, it's booted onto the next line. Versus something like an anchor tag, we have two of them right here, and an image actually. They share that space. This anchor tag is not forced onto its own line, this one's not. They are happy to coexist together. So we have two different types of elements here. We have block level elements, like a H1 or H2, all the heading elements. Also a paragraph is another example of what we've seen so far, where if we added a paragraph anywhere, let's just do it up top though to start. Let's do an anchor tag. I'm just going to type some gibberish in here. Let's do two anchor tags. I'm going to delete this anyway. Those are not block level. They are inline elements. They share the space. You can see them there. As soon as I add a paragraph or an H1 in here, in between the two, it doesn't matter that VS Code is going to put that paragraph on its own line. That doesn't make a difference in terms of behavior. Now you can see what happens. We have our first anchor tag, then we have this paragraph, and this paragraph wants to exist on its own line, its own block. So it takes up an entire block. And if we actually inspect this element, right click inspect, and I hover over that paragraph or the P element, you can see how it goes all the way across the screen. All that blue stuff, even if it's empty, there's not enough content to fill it, it does take up that whole block. Compare that to this anchor tag. Its blue highlight around it is really just the content and that's it. Or if we look at one of these anchor tags down here, they share the space. Okay, so that's the basic idea between a block element and an inline element. We can change this behavior using CSS later on, but it's an important distinction. And it now leads us to two elements I'm going to introduce, the span and the div, both of which are kind of generic containers, generic elements that may not seem that useful right now, but it's important to cover them. So let's begin with divs. I would bet if you asked the majority of developers who use HTML, most of them would not know what div means or why it's called a div. Apparently, it's the content division element, so division, divider. Most people don't know that, at least in my experience at least. It could totally be completely wrong, but that's just my personal experience. It's kind of a weird term, but div is just a generic container to hold things or to group elements together. And it is a block level element. So if I add a div around some content, that div is going to take up a whole block and force content above and below it. Now, why would you do this? Right now, we don't really have a good reason to do it. But once we get to CSS, we can use divs as a way to group content together. You can see this example right here. There's actually, if I just get rid of all of this CSS for a moment, there's an image and there's a paragraph all the way down here. It says, beware of the leopard. And then there's a div wrapping them so that they are grouped together. And then we can style them. We can add CSS to add a border around the div. So it's just a way to group content together to treat it similarly. Or to do something with it. So, for example, can you see this background here? This slight grayish light blue background. Well, there's a bunch of elements in here. We haven't talked about buttons, but there's a button. There's probably more buttons here. An image here for that logo. This is probably some H something, some heading element. But there's a border and a background around everything. They're grouped together, most likely using a div or one of the more modern alternatives that we'll see shortly. So for now, divs are not going to seem useful, but I'm just going to show them to you briefly. I've got my two anchor tags right here. You can see them right there. I am a link to Google and about page. Now, if I wrap them in a div, just like that, I now have put them inside of a block level element. So they are going to take up their own block. Well, the div is, and they happen to be inside that div. So I'm going to refresh, and there you go. So if we inspect now, you'll see that right here I've still got my two anchor tags. They are still just inline elements. They take up the minimum amount of space they need, but the div that I'm highlighting right now goes all the way across. It takes up a full block. So again, divs won't seem very useful at the moment, but when we get to CSS, they allow us to group content together and style it all at once. Here's another simple example. We've got an image and then some sort of description, a paragraph, and then a button here. And then there's a border around all of that. So there's not just a border around the image or a border around this or a border around the this other image or the button or whatever this is. It's around everything. So they're grouped in some sort of container. Same thing over here, or this right here. All of these examples happen to be with a border, which is not the only thing you would do with a div, but they're just convenient to show right now since we haven't actually seen any CSS. Okay, so the next element that I'm going to show you kind of serves a similar purpose. It's called a span. And the span is another generic container, but it is an inline element. So we would wrap this around any sort of text or content that we want to single out later on to style with CSS or to do something with, and it's just a generic element. So here, using CSS, all the ingredients, it looks like basil, pine nuts, garlic. Ooh, sounds like pesto. I love pesto. Basil, pine nuts, garlic, and olive oil are red. So there's not a red element that we could use, and we don't want to make them bold, so we're not going to use like a B element or something like that. A span is just a generic element that we can wrap around, in this case, each ingredient. So there's a bunch of spans, and then using CSS, we can add some styles to those spans. So again, we're not doing that now. We will eventually. It's pretty soon, honestly. But that's the point of a span. So same idea as a div, except for that main big difference. A span is inline. So it does not take up its own block of content. It's just a way to call something out so we could style it differently. So here's an example. I'm on Reddit, the chickens subreddit. And if you notice, some of these titles have these tags. Roasted chicken, and then it says media here. It looks like there's some other options. Here's more media. It says we can do media, discussion, and question. So anyway, this right here is just text, just regular old text inside of, if we inspect it, this is one of the reasons the DevTools, or the reasons I showed you the DevTools is so we can do things like this. If I inspect it, it looks like it's an H3, and then this right here is a span. If you can see that, there's a bunch of other stuff, but it is a span, and it's singled out so it can be treated differently. It can be styled. It's given that rounded corners there, sort of a pill shape. It's given a background color. So that is done using a span. It's just a generic thing, right? We don't need to make this, I guess it could be a button, which we haven't covered, but it's just a piece of text. So it doesn't make sense to make it a heading or to make it an anchor tag or something. It is just a piece of text. So we single it out using a span. So once again, spans are inline. So I could add a span around something like, let's do it around Google. The word Google there. We won't see anything change whatsoever. I'm going to refresh. Nothing happens, but if I inspect, there now is this generic, let me make that a bit larger, this generic span wrapping around the word Google. So I could then go style it differently once we talk about CSS. So those are divs and spans. Again, not that useful for now, but there's a reason I'm introducing them this early on.